also has its.
I'm teaching Ezra in Nechamia for a few years, and just like every kid in high school learns math and then forgets it all during the summer, it comes back next year. The same is true with Ezra. It's been not quite a year because they used to give me the peak days, which was New Year's Day. That was my favorite day because people were appropriately intoxicated, couldn't understand anything I said. But now I'm the early person, so let me give you some review. We've done the entire book of Ezra. Let's review the timeline. So there's this famous 70-year time period that was announced by Yirmiyahu. The official 70 years that Yirmiyahu was speaking about had nothing to do with the Beis Hamikdash, had to do with the extent of the Babylonian rule. It started when Nebuchadnezzar came to power and eventually ended in the first year of Cyrus. That's the original 70 years. People tend to think of it as the 70 years of the Beis Hamikdash not existing, and it turns out that's true also, but that's not what Yirmiyahu forecasted. Okay, so he forecasted that once the Babylonians came into power, within the first 10 years, they took 10,000 of the leaders of the Jewish people and brought them to Babel. Maybe, and included in that was Yechezkel, and also, I know I'm going to find Yechezkel and
Daniel.
Daniel, right? Thank you. Yechezkel and Daniel were there, and Yechezkel and Daniel overlapped, and it was the last years of Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu obviously lived another 10 years to see the Beis Hamikdash destroyed. And we don't really know what happened to him after that. It looks like he went to Egypt. There are rumors that he was murdered by the Israelis for forecasting what was going to happen. So you have Daniel and Yechezkel going to Babel. My claim is Yechezkel is the person who is most responsible for the existence of the Jewish people, because he kept the content of the Jewish people alive in Galus. Without him, there's no reason that the Jewish people would have survived. So he kept them alive, and Hashem gave him these prophecies, and he had to prove to the people that God heard their prayers even in Choslar. And that's why it opens with the vision. Now, last time I mentioned there's a very great parallel between what happened in the time of Ezra and what happened in the time of the creation of the state of Israel. The start of it was with Cyrus. Cyrus gave them permission to only build the Beis Hamikdash. Had no interest in Jerusalem. He had no interest in anything more than that. He didn't have any interest in there being another country, people called Am Yisrael. He just wanted the temple built. He had his own personal war, and he committed to building the temple, and he authorized the construction of the temple. And there was a written letter that was signed by him. Okay, so comes the time of Cyrus, and it announced its time, and eventually 40,000 plus people go to make Aliyah. These are self-selected, most likely. They probably didn't travel in one group, but there's no evidence that all 40,000. We know that when Ezra traveled, there was one group. But it was over a period of time. How long a period of time, we don't know. But the people came with self-motivated. Very much like in the Aliyah in the 1800s and 1900s, it was all self-motivated people. There was no leader to encourage them to make Aliyah. There was Rabbi. He led the trip, but there's no evidence of anyone recruiting people to go. And that's a major aspect that Rabbi Angel talks about. that building of the second coming of the state of Israel was driven by the people themselves, not by people. And that's why Ezra and Nechamia have long lists of all the families that participated. But we felt it was important that we be aware of who the people were who did that. They come here. The only thing they're able comes close to Rosh Hashanah, and all they're able to do is they build an altar. They make no effort to start building a base of Mikdash. And it was another 17 years before they started the base of Mikdash. There were people around them that were protesting, interrupting any of their work. And they waited till 17 years. Why did they wait? Why did they get started? Because we have two Nevi'im who are with them eventually in Eretz Yisrael. Haggai and Zechariah. Haggai and Zechariah said, you need to get started building the base of Mikdash. We guarantee you that you will succeed. So with the encouragement of Haggai and Zechariah, they started building it. That 17 years means they started building it, it was actually 70 years from the time the base of Mikdash. So there's another 70 years, but that's not the 70 years that we forecasted, but it is a 70-year period from when the destruction of the temple until they made significant progress. Now, Cyrus was committed to the space of Mikdash. That's it. He had zero interest in the city of Jerusalem. To build the city of Jerusalem, we know what's the challenge when we try to build the city of Jerusalem. What does the world not like about it? What do they see it as? This is an open-ended question. It's a national city, it's a capital. Cyrus had zero interest in recreating the state of Israel. He had no specific interest in Yerushalayim and didn't invest anything in it. So, again, the way the Nevi'im described it, he had a vision that he would build this space of Mikdash, and he was known. One of the interesting things is, I'm not sure which God is the most powerful. You do things for every God. And he had the nevuah about the God of Israel, and he therefore built the temples. But he built other temples. I mean, he was known to be totally receptive to local religion. That's known from the record. It's not just based on Tanakh.
Which Cyrus is this?
This is Cyrus the Great. Now, which Cyrus is? It's probably the last one.
No, because there's a question if he was Esther's son.
Okay, let's back up. Okay. Those of you who are more traditional, I don't use the Medrash for anything. Tell me what the facts are. The Medrash has a purpose. The one purpose it doesn't have is to tell me the facts. So when the Medrash says these three kings were the same king, all they're trying to tell you that it really didn't matter who was the king, they were all equally bad, or equally good. But it's not that these three kings were one king. Our tradition would say, who was the real leader who led the Aliyah? You would say it was Ezra, right? Ezra's known for it. Ezra didn't show up for 70 years after the first people made Aliyah.
So, how many?
Nechamia.
And Nechamia came 17 years after that. And it's not my idea that Ezra wasn't there. And that's why I have a problem with the Medrash. Ezra says it. Ezra says, all these kings passed, and I went with the seventh year of the king of, not Achashverosh, but the king, why am I drawing a blank? Xerxes. So, the text makes it clear he wasn't there. The text makes it clear he wasn't there when they built the base, base of Mikdash, which, as I said, was 17 years after they got there. Ezra doesn't come for another 60, 70 years.
67?
60 to 70 years, I don't remember exactly.
After the first,
after the base image was built,
wow,
right? That's not the image of we have in Chazal, right? Ezra is it's far more important in Chazal than Nechamia. In terms of recorded activity, Nechamia more as, there's no comparison with what Nechamia did versus what Ezra did as written in Ezra and Nechamia. The handout in the back.
Okay.
Okay, so as I said, if you want to understand how to read Chazal, there's a book written by,
Sure.
it's based on the Rambam's son. Okay, here's some more handouts.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
You want to understand how my view of learning Medrash is based on the Rambam's attitude towards it. And he was very upset at people who took things literally. And he thought if you take Midrash literally, the rest of the world will laugh at it. And he was very concerned about it. And that's generally been the tradition of the Sfardim. And the record that we have, Rambam wanted to write something on Medrash. He didn't have enough time. He apparently ran out of time. I don't know what he was doing. But he ran out of time. So his son, Avraham ben Harambam, wrote a famous book that for a long time was lost. You at least have part of the book. And it's the part that's often used to be written in a book called the Ein Yaakov. The Ein Yaakov, until Art Scroll came along, included the letter of the Rambam's son. It no longer includes it. The Rambam's son gives a description that you're not supposed to, take any of these things literally. You have to be, and he has lots of proofs. And as I said, this is a New English translation. It's very readable. And he starts out with pointing out that the Gonim did not believe that Midrashim should be taken off. And we did have right. There are lots of quotes. It's just novel to us, especially we all grew up. I didn't quite grow up, but we all saw Rashi early on. And that's one of the big mistakes of Jewish education. We start learning Rashi right away, and you read the first Rashi, and you're now hooked into Midrashim, right? About what was happening. That's not how the Rambam and his people in the Sfardim took things. Okay. So that's some of the background, but thanks for asking the question.
yeah. But you didn't really answer it. About,
Again, she wasn't asked, Esther. Okay,
okay,
okay. You have the handout?
yeah.
Turn to page 2. Do you have a page 2? Yes, it's on the back. You made it 2
In the
slides.
back, yeah.
Okay. So one of the most prominent Navi teachers in YU, very different than when I went to Yeshiva University. When I went to Yeshiva University, Navi was taught by Rabbi who needed to make some extra money, and they taught Navi the way they learned it in Yeshiva. Angel was always a biblical scholar, and he created this chart. He gives it out the first when they start learning Yechezkel, and he lays out the kings and their relative things. So Nebuchadnezzar, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, and Daniel. Cyrus II the Great was in 538. That's 70 years. 7 years after the original one, Nebuchadnezzar, and he's 538, 536. That's just with regard to when Aliyah was made. So Aliyah began in 538, but in part by Zerubbabel and someone named Yeshua. Yeshua was the Kohen. Then we have Ezra. We don't know who the king was, maybe Ahasuerus. But that's Mordechai and Esther are 483, right? Which is 50 years later. So it is possible he was the son of Esther. There's nothing in here that contradicts the possibility. And part of the reason is he was very positively disposed to reconstructing Jerusalem. Okay, so Ezra doesn't come until 458, right, which is about 80 years after the first, 58 to 38. And that was going, I only have a PhD in applied math.
80 years.
80 years, thank you. That's 80 years after the first people came. And then this I can't pronounce, Artaxerxes is the one in his 7th year, he gives permission to start rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. And that's with the people who made Aliyah.
You know, I have a question about this. According to this, you're disregarding what the Gemara says,
Absolutely.
that 420 years was the total length of time to the second base of Mikdash.
Okay.
And you're making this a lot more. And most of the current historians are in line with what the Gemara says. 420 years, which would make Shivas Zion at approximately 420.
Okay. So, as I mentioned before, a few minutes before you came in, I don't follow the timeline of Chazal anymore. And that's based on the way the Rambam's son explained the Rambam's view about how you interpret Midrashim.
420 is 420.
I understand. And they may not have known exactly what it was. Chazal compressed the time period. Chazal think the classic Midrash says these 3 kings are the same king. That takes away about 50 years that we know, because we have real records, not random records. We have real records of how long each king was the king. These are well documented. They're not something subject to debate. Chazal compress that to 1 year, 1 king. In addition, Chazal made the impression that Ezra led the Aliyah. As I said before, Ezra was 60 to 70 years after the Aliyah happened. So yes, there's a very much inconsistent in the way Chazal presented. And as I said, the Rambam's son, the Rabbi Ben Rambam, wrote a major work, probably 300 to 400 pages long. We only have maybe 30 pages of it. And as I said, it's been translated now and it's readily available. And he talks about that the Gaonim never took the Midrashim literally. That relates also to the years. Okay, so it is radical, but the point I make out is it's impossible to say Ezra, unless you say all the kings were compressed into 1, there's no way you can say Ezra was anywhere near the base of Midrash. Because Ezra himself said, there was this king, and I came at this king. So unless you compress it, he wouldn't have been there. But the way Ezra describes it, he came along after the base of Midrash was built. So I have a tendency to prefer the Tanakh rather than a Midrash that's trying to compress the Tanakh. Okay? So in certain audiences, I've been kicked out. I made the mistake of once giving a share to people from the Colville, like with Colville in Detroit. It didn't work out well for me. Okay. So this is sort of like a review. And it answers the question about which Cyrus. Okay. So Ezra eventually shows up. And why is Ezra here? Ezra describes himself. Why is he coming? He's coming to be Ezra the Hasofer. Okay. He has 1 line that describes what he's there for. And I have it on the first page. Who Ezra, Allah mi baba, who sofer ma here, but Torah Moshe Kenoth on Hashem, okay, so we can go on now. Yeah, Hashem. And we'll call Allah call back Hashem. And I just said this was the later king. And all it says is he's a sofer, and that was going to be his role. So Ezra's primary role was to teach Torah in Ezra. There was probably Torah there already. may not have had a Sefer Torah. We don't know the nature of the population that went. We know that they intermarried. The first intermarriage in Tanakh is always intermarrying with the people around them, even though there are prohibitions against that. Obviously, Shlomo now did that on a regular basis. Ezra, when he decides to come, eventually recruits only 1,500 people. There were already over 40,000 people made it on the already. He's able to recruit only 1,500. And Nebuch, he couldn't find any Levium, just like he can't find in Shul. He couldn't find any Levium but one go. He had to stop and recruit Levium. Ezra was never thrilled with the Levium. And we have one of the most not well known, but most unusual halachos in all of the Gemara. In certain periods of time, you didn't give maser to the Levium, you gave it to the Kohen. It's in the Gemara, but it is a rather startling statement. Eventually, they were giving it back. So he delayed his time. He had to wait till he could recruit some Levium. He wanted them, and when he gets there, again, the people are the motivating for almost everything that happens. Ezra shows up. The people come to him and complain about the leadership having intermarried. Not Ezra's observation first. The people bring the problem to Ezra. He then works on it. He's at most moderately successful. The Nach only points to 100 people who left their wives. The question is whether that was just a symbolic, but there are a lot more, or no, that's all. Because we do know in Nechamia, he tackles the problem again and is much more successful. Okay, so we're not gonna get that far today. Okay. So that's,
Dr. Chelst,
yes,
at that time, Jews were allowed to have more than one Jewish wife, so surely they could have a pelagish.
okay. First of all, these were wives, they weren't pelagish. There's a machlokas among the Rishonim. Are you prohibited? Don't tell this anyone you know. Are you prohibited in the Torah from marrying a non-Jew? Because I'll debate it.
So what's the answer?
What?
What's the answer?
No, it's debated. Okay, but it's certainly an issue to Rabbi. Okay. Oh, I said the man. I wasn't talking about the woman. Okay, so yes, it's debated what the halacha is. We know the Shiva Amamim were prohibited min haTorah, and at least for the generation. But we also have a tradition that by the time Nebuchadnezzar, we didn't know who anybody was. So we couldn't have pointed to the Shiva Amamim by the time here. And you have them marrying, and some of the leaders of the community were marrying non-Jew. So Moshe wasn't the best example for us.
There's an island off of between Israel and whatever that Ezra sent a letter because there were a lot of Levium there.
Right.
And he said, if they don't return to Yerushalayim within a year, they're not.
Okay, so I need the reference.
And I know.
I know where he's sitting shul.
And I know the young man who went there, who was a lady. In other words,
Right.
20, 30 years ago, and they wouldn't allow him to, he went there for his PhD. And they wouldn't allow him to stay there more than a year because they felt that the
That's sort of a cherem of Levium living.
was still around now. That's our current.
Right. So sometimes we have letters.
Where is it? Where is that opportunity?
That's probably near Jerba or whatever.
The German, yeah, that's it.
Right. And we know about letters that were written. Yirmiyahu wrote a letter and gives us the entire script. The kings wrote letters that authorized, and as I said, just like Balfour authorized the Jews to come back, we had a leader authorizing it, but the people came were self-selected. And the Gemara debates. And this is, again, there's no conclusion. Were these the best people who made Aliyah or the worst people who made Aliyah? They don't decide which it is. It depends upon whether Ezra had to pick them to come, or no, they self-selected. And what were they worried about? What was gonna happen in Baba?
I have to give you the exact time. I don't have it exactly, but I will give it to you before Tuesday, okay?
Would be in trouble, but there's no evidence that
6 o'clock.
any problems existed in Baba with the Jewish community.
Y'all too.
It was probably the greatest Jewish religious community in the history of the world. It survived 2,500 years. Right from time of Chelst until Iraq kicked us all out. And the communities were religious. I mean, that's where the Talmud comes from. Comes from Babel, it doesn't come from Eretz Yisrael. There is a Yerushalmi. Daf Yomi didn't discover it yet, so not many people know it.
There's a Yerushalmi element.
What? I know there is, but it's not as popular.
Don't forget, most of the leaders that were exiled were leaders, not into Babel. That's why.
Yeah, and Yirmiyahu wrote okay. If I'm not going to teach you because I've taught it, I might come back and teach it. Yechezkel had a challenge. What would it be like the first 20,000 Jews to come to America? Exact same thing. They come to Babel. Babel is the major power of the world. They have avodah zarah everywhere. And he managed to create a vibrant Orthodox Jewish community that created Torah Shabbat Pact. Remember, he's there already with the Knesset Sagdola, which is not written in any text, but and the Gemara and the leadership of the Jewish world with the Gaonim in Babel.
Mhm.
So 1,000 years from the time in the base of English being destroyed, we know for sure the real leadership of the Jewish people were involved. And then I'm saying is, you looked at the community that was in Iraq, they were a very religious community. And there are no texts that talk about intermarriage that I know of in the Babylonian community. There is about the Israeli community. Right. Gotten through the history yet? The background? Okay. So one of the books that I really like that I'm going to do today, but I didn't go too far. Magid is a major, relatively new press. I think it's like 15 years old. They tend to be less traditional way of presenting. Not that there's any issues about this. So the essay on Nechamia, written by Dov Zakheim, right? And Dov Zakheim used to teach Nechamia in between the time he was the assistant secretary for the United States government. First under Reagan, and there he was the deputy assistant. Under George Bush, he was the assistant secretary. He's also the person who gave the final decision that Israel should not build the Lapid jet. That was a waste of resources, and then they would never be able to keep up with all the resources. And that was true. And now Israel enhances all the jets, but they didn't design them first. But he's talking about it with extensive knowledge of political leadership. So he's bringing that background as he reads the story of what's going on between the lines, behind the scenes, in terms of. Okay. He provided the most important thing to help me give this year today. Perfect.
Or,
I'll give you afterwards.
Hold on to the stem.
Okay, so
You wrote about Nechamia?
what? This book is about Sefer Nechamia. He was much more interested in Nechamia because Nechamia was clearly the major political leader, whereas Ezra was not. Ezra had one role to enhance religious basis, and that's what he's called Ezra Sofer. And here's an example of a medrash that on the surface doesn't make any sense, that if Moshe Rabbeinu had not given the Torah, God would have had Ezra give the Torah. And there's no way to say that Ezra was on a par with Moshe Rabbeinu. There's just no way you can say that. But what was Ezra's gift? Ezra was like Moshe, totally dedicated to teaching the Torah. That was his mission in life. And that was ultimately the primary mission of Moshe Rabbeinu. Not all the other stories we hear about him. It was to teach in Torah. Ezra was totally committed to that. And he came to a community which didn't have teachers, and he started teaching. And the people came to him and they asked for his guidance. And that way, he was, in some sense, appropriate for being given the Torah, because he, more than any other person, was prepared to teach it under difficult circumstances. I have to call you back. I'm teaching. Bye. It's my son. Where's the Chinese desk go? Go past that. That's my son. He's the one who gave me the stuff from Rabbi Angel. Okay. So what does Nechamia do? He comes, he meets with the king of his time, and the queen is by his side, and he actually gets not only the king, but the queen behind his mission. He says he needs to go to Jerusalem because his ancestors are buried there. He wants to rebuild the physical community. Unlike Ezra, who traveled alone with 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 Jews, and no armed guard, Nechamia had an armed group that was sent with him by the king. So he's traveling. He shows up in Yerushalayim. Doesn't make a big deal when he first shows up. And then 3 nights after he arrives, he puts together a small team and secretly walks around the walls of Jerusalem, documenting where there are holes. Doesn't tell anybody he's going to do that.
Where there, what?
What? Where the walls were in bad shape. He wrote them down, and he gives a description of where the wall, in the book, in the Nechamia, there's a description of where the wall. The sad problem is that we don't know most of these places. Okay, so he knows what work needs to be done. Now, who's going to do the work? One way is to do the way most armies are right now. You recruit workers, you pay them, and who are the first workers who always work? Like in the American Army, right? The people who need the job, and not what Nechamia does. Nechamia says, I'm going to set up groups of people, 5, 10, 15, and I'm giving them, this is your section of the wall, and that's your job to build that thing. And this is your section. Now, though Zakheim goes through details about which sections were appropriate to which section, why the Kohanim were given a certain important gate, because that was the most important gate at the time. But I did always copy a few lines on page 3. Okay. And this is in the middle of chapter 3 where he's building. So he says, next to them, Yediah, son of Haruma, Beneged Beso, Ayoda Hatush ben Hashbani. So what do you see that's important? Where is he building? What area has he been given
Front of
responsibility?
his house.
Front of his house. And if you want to protect your house, that's a good idea to make them the builders. And you're responsible for the wall by your house. The Kohanim were also builders. They were given walls to protect the closest spots to the base of the. And then it goes on a second stretch. And then verse 12, and next to them, Shalom, son of the charmer, chief of the half district. But he had his daughters working with him, building the wall. We're not talking about serving coffee. Then goes on in verse 15, Shalom, son of Kol Chozer, chief of the district of Mitzvah. This is a high-ranking person in the Jewish community there. Repaired the fountain gate. That was an each gate was tended to be given to somebody who was an important family. He rebuilt it, covered it, set up doors, locks and bars, as well as the wall of the gate. So this is an important person. He made sure the important people had appropriate places to build. And he also made sure that people were building in their own neighborhood, and they were building as a family. And there's a whole chapter on it. It's called Building the Wall. Okay. So that's chapter 3, and we're moving on now to the focus, chapter 4. And as I said, he reads between the lines. So, I have the Kenneth, okay, chapter 4. So if somebody wants to read it, we can start with just reading the English if you want. Any volunteers? Any Chinese volunteers?
When Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs, the Amorites and the Ashdodites heard that healing had come to the walls of Jerusalem and that the breached parts had begun to be filled in, it angered them very much. And they all conspired together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to throw it into confusion. Because of them, we prayed to our God and set up a watch over them, the workers on the walls day and night.
Okay.
How come they call people Arabs? And didn't that come much later?
Okay, so the word Aravim appears in Tanakh. It doesn't mean the Arab that we know. But the word Arab is mentioned in Tanakh, long before our traditions of what we call Arab. Okay? So yes, Vehi Kasher Shama Sanballat Tobiah Baharim. I didn't make that up. Arabs. Okay, so you have Sanballat, who's not Jewish. What about this guy named Tobiah? Is he Jewish or not?
Isn't that Moshe's name?
What?
Isn't Tuvia Moshe's name?
Okay, so that's a different metric.
One of his names.
Only one of his names. It's just like me. I get my children's names confused. My wife wouldn't let me name them all with the same name.
Welcome to the club.
Right. Okay. So there's a whole field of archaeology. There's archaeology built around text. And I can never remember the name. I know something long word. And you get a sense of population by looking what names they use. The people who are Jews, and if by this time they're already called Jews, that's the official term for them, Judeans. If you have a name like Tuvia, with God's name at the end, most likely you're. So this Tuvia, who's a partner with Sanballat, was Jewish. He was living in the areas away from Yerushalayim. And that kind of makes it, look at this. Sanballat might have been affected by what was going on. Tuvia might have been affected by. What do these other people have to do with the problem? They're not anywhere near Yerushalayim. But it's what happens throughout Jewish history. The people who managed to recruit the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites to be part of a coalition to attack
Farm workers.
So that's one of the things that he points to. And as I said, it's not just Sanballat and Tuvia that goes out of the way. And the Aravim, I forgot, there's a certain area that we call the Arab people in that area Aravim. I don't remember exactly what I don't know, it's not Saudi Arabia, because that's too far away, for people to be worried about the people there. Okay. So what's the start? They have to have workers day and night. The good news, there are no environmental restrictions. I know, worse than that, there were no people charged with getting authorization for that you constructed the right way. He built the entire wall around Yerushalayim in 52 days. You wouldn't even get the paperwork done. 52 days, that's all. He needed that wall finished, because these people were going to constantly argue with him at every step of the way. And then he in verse 4, Tammy.
Judah was saying this that carry the fail. There is so much rubble, we are not able ourselves to rebuild the wall.
Okay, so stop there for a second. So when I read this, okay, so this something happened. He says these are the prototype of the people who are not committed to really building the wall. They're already worn out. You know, I've done enough, right? It's not just the strength of the basket carrier, but you know, it meant that it was not just physical strength that they lacked, it was also commitment. Next.
And our foes will say, before they know or see it, we shall be in among them and kill them. Put a stop to the break.
Okay, so the enemies are seeing people drop their responsibilities, and they're very optimistic. Okay.
When the Jews living near the foes would arrive, they would tell us from all places where you shall come back to us.
Okay. So the charge of Jews being another enemy behind the scenes or working with the enemy, maybe not in America, but in history it was often true. These Jews who were friends with Sanballat and lived in the 20, 30, 40 miles from Yerushalayim, they joined this other force. There's no war yet, but they used that opportunity to keep the people of Yerushalayim abreast of all the planning that was going on. And that kind of points out that would certainly have been true for the Jews from the Arab world who came there. They knew what was going on in the Arab world. Some places they left a lot of Jews, like in Iran. Now it's more dangerous. There's no doubt Iranian Jews helped keep us informed about what was going on in Iran and all the other countries. And that's what it says. When the Jews living near the foes would arrive, they would tell us exactly when they were planning on attacking. So they had spies who seemed like they were turncoats. Okay, so how does Nechamia use this information? Verse 7.
I stationed at the lower level, right behind the walls on their lot. I stationed the people by families with their swords, their dances, and their.
Okay, so it's nothing unusual about. Trouble speaking too long without water. It was very interesting when I speak on Yom Kippur. I said, you know, I need water. My wife is going to get up and get me some. Okay. It says he talks about it comes verse 8.
Then I decided to exhort the nobles, the speak after them, do not be afraid of that. Think of the great and awesome Lord, fight for your brothers, your sons and daughters, your wives.
Implied in this is that these people weren't volunteers in the first request for people to work. He had to give a special speech to the upper class. In the American Army, except for the people who come to Annapolis and West Point, is not made up of the upper class of America. Right? And these people, who were the first to intermarry, as happens in America, the most prestigious people, Jews and some we hear, the people who get intermarried into the communities were among the leaders. So he specifically said, right? Okay, So interestingly, what's the verb in verse 8? In the beginning of verse 8, what's the verb?
Yeah.
Andrea, the number that
Sorry.
you helped, what was that called? The passcode or something?
Right? The
The
word
number that
in,
you gave me helped me open up the screen. What was that? It's called passcode. So password. So does everything have a password? I call up.
not, yeah, well, you have to tell when to mute. Motion
I'll-
friends.
yeah,
I don't know, he's in this room.
He's on Zoom.
I know he's on Zoom, right?
okay. That's okay.
I generally don't, I'm not bothered by any of my students, whatever they do in class. As long as they don't snore when they speak. That's my trouble line. They can eat, they can do anything else, but they can't snore. That's very disruptive. I take it personally. So although he translated things word, the verse says, "Re'gar ba'kum bomar elachorim." It's not a translation of the words. It just says, I got up and spoke. The translation interpreted is that you have to speak with force. Maybe that's why ba'kum, but that's not the words in Hebrew,
No, it's not.
right? And to these people, he didn't say this to the first round of people, do not be afraid of them. And he gives them the most powerful standing motivation. Fight for your brothers, your sons and daughters, your wives and your home. You're not fighting for the country, you're fighting for your own families. And he built that into this construction of the wall. So he's trying to motivate them to fight. The text doesn't say anything.
What does the horror mean? It's a strange word. It means a horror.
Omar el-Ahorim Belaskanim.
Who is a horror?
Those are nobles.
That's strange.
Okay, I can look it up in my Mikros Kedolos.
Horror usually means holes.
I understand. Just like kick the bucket doesn't mean kick the bucket. Okay? Many words have multiple meanings, and the worst example of that is Koheles. Don't try to explain
It's
the
a,
one word in Koheles that appears over and over again.
But this
and
is-
has the same meaning throughout Koheles.
horror is a degrading name.
Okay, I'm sure it's not. And again, Nechamia is writing this. This is the language he wrote. Okay,
Okay.
and we'll see he has to turn to them again because it didn't work. Again, Zach, I'm reading between the lines. He says, do you notice there's no response? He doesn't record any response to these people when he's told them. Then he goes on to the next paragraph, Tammy. From that day on,
From that day on, half my servants did work and brought flags, lancers, and shields, bows, and officers. And the officers stood behind the whole house, who were building the wall. The basket carriers were burdened, doing work with one hand, while the other held the weapon. As for the builders, each had a sword burden at his side as he was building. Trumpeters stood
so
beside.
this image of what's going on is very similar to what would have been happening in 48. Of the Israelis working in the various kibbutzim, they had to have their weapons ready.
Mhm.
Now, there was some subset that were just soldiers. Most of them would have to split their time. And he was worried, how many people could be building one section of wall? 10, 20, 30. What's the first rule of, I'm a great military strategist. I know a place. What's the name? Strategico? That's about my extent of. So the way an army typically works is they pick a weakest enemy attack. Given the number of people living in Yerushalayim, there was no way he could put sufficient resources around every place. So what was his strategy? He said, I'm going to put a trumpeter and the trumpeter would have the responsibility that when reports came in, there was an attack on one particular spot, the community would then go to that site to reinforce that part of the wall. So that was his strategy that he was using. Okay, and again, Marty, you want to read the last one? Last page. The last page is on the last page. Okay, there's only one last page, page 5.
I said to the nobles, the prefects, and the rest of the people, there is much work and it's spread out. We are scattered over the wall, far from one another. When you hear a trumpet call, gather yourself to me at your place. Our God will fight for us. And so we worked on, while half were holding lances from the break of the day until the stars appeared. I further said to the people at that time, let every man with a servant lodge in Jerusalem, that we may use the night to stand guard and the day to work. Nor did I, my brothers, my servants, or the guards following me, ever take off our clothes, even uncertain for which his weapon.
Okay, so
Even
there's
all-
a phrase in there that's not clear.
Yeah,
But we learned from this that Samuel was leading by example. And he has his cohort working with him,
yes, thank you.
right? They were standing day and night. He goes on to say he was working so hard that he didn't have a chance to change his clothing. And in the beginning, what's the first thing that says in 13? I said to the nobles, the prefects, and the rest of the people, there's much work. And I thought he already spoken to them. So as I said, Lackheim reads between the lines saying that the first time didn't have any impact. He had to repeat at this point, and when he was telling them we're too thin, we're being sent around, you're going to need to hear a trumpet and respond. So this is the image of them building Yerushalayim, very much the same as when we first started in the 1800s, well, not actually more in the 1900s, where they had to be on guard from the enemies, local neighbors or enemies, yeah.
I had a friend who was during the Holocaust, was hiding from the Nazis. He told me he always had his clothes on. He moved from one place to another, just in case they came up to his apartment. He had his clothes on. This way.
I just wondered, we don't have the Greek here. Are the nobles called Forum
Okay.
in Pasuk 13 too?
You have, oh, here it is. It's not in front of me. What did it say there?
That's Chad. This is
What verse is that?
14, 13.
Omar el Hachorim,
Oh, that's so far.
el Espanim, el Yesar Amaka Habe, Chava, Menachem Nefadim. And he's saying that it's a big job. You're working in small groups, but you're part of a big community that's trying to protect the Jewish people. Okay, so the wall gets built. And the next chapter is an unusual chapter. It's something that America has not successfully been able to handle. And it's called income inequality. And Nechamia was worried that income inequality would destroy the morale of the people. So he had to address it.
And I have a question on verse 10, where it says that the officers stood behind the whole house of Judah. Is that to protect them or to motivate them?
again. That kind would be between the lines, I mean, either to motivate them, or somebody, when you hear, if they heard a trumpet, somebody has to make a decision, they have to go somewhere. But I don't think they're motivating them, but they, again, the people who are building walls weren't necessarily wall builders. I mean, so you had to have some level of supervision about how the work gets done. I mean, the one job when I was a construction worker, I could handle the job of carrying things from one place to the other. I didn't really like it when I had to walk up 10 floors, because there's no elevator. But I can handle that job. The worst job you can have is to walk up 10 floors and realize you're in the wrong building.
Really?
And you see across, oh, that's the people on that 10th floor, that's where you had to work. So yeah, it's not clear what he says, but he does have more. It doesn't say how he, most likely these are the people, of course, in addition, if there was going to be a battle, these people certainly didn't know how to fight a battle. They had weapons, so they may have been there in case there was a battle. That's probably my best guess of why they had to have people around. Okay. Anything else? You survived the first day.
Thank you.
Sure.
And I won't give us longer review. So looking at the group, some of my friends in the third row, most of you had not been here when I learned Ezra and I hope I didn't shock you too much.
It's still very disturbed because the Gemara says openly the base of English, second base of English, last
Okay.
only
How tall
420
was Moshe?
years.
How tall was Moshe already?
That's one thing, and this is something else.
Okay, it says it explicitly, and it's a number.
Yeah, I know.
10 hours.
It's pretty tall.
He wasn't. But it has a very nice explanation.
That's one when he was old.
Okay, so you're right. They give specifics, but there are lots of places where we have specifics. Now, one of the things you need, I don't remember exactly where the Gemara is. Look and see who made that statement. Okay. For example, why do we, I wouldn't say celebrate. Why do we climb Tisha B'Av for? Why do we have a Tisha B'Av? What did the Jews do wrong?
You're talking about the second base of English?
Yeah,
Sineskino.
Sinoskino. You sure that's what happened? It says it. It was made a statement by an Amora who wasn't there 300 years later. Oh, by the way, nobody knows the Gemara unless you learn Daf Yomi. There are 4 other reasons they give. That's not the only reason they give, but it's the one that became popular. And we as a call accepted that one because that's the one message we need all the time. Right? So one of the things that he points to is, unlike when you see halacha, there's no debate about that with the halacha. Most of the midrashic statements are said by an Amora or a Tana by himself, not saying that my Rabbi taught me this and my Rabbi's Rabbi. You read the Gemara and you lose track of how many generations are telling you of an Amora. There's not in the midrash. It's usually not written as this is what I heard from my Rabbi, from my Rabbi's Rabbi. But the Rambam says that these people took the text and learned from it and had a message. Okay, but yes, it is explicitly 420. It's one of the questions I have. I don't really think you're going to let me debate. I have lots of questions. Did you really believe what you said? Yes, it says 420. Part of the message there was.